Bliss Township Historical Travelogue of Bliss places whose general appearance had not changed much since 1925. Elnora Fay Lee took most of these pictures in 1972 and a few later. It consists of 93 pictures of 55 sites. The snapshot should be used in an overhead projector. Many of these places were built in the early 1900s. My book, A Century of Bliss, gives more details as to their history. Now for their story. History researchers soon learn that original and old sources have disappeared or are on the way out. When I was researching Bliss history back in the 1960s, I saw that the old farm buildings had changed since I was a girl at home. I decided to see how many of the old places were still there. My memory of the area was best of the 1925 era, so I traveled the roads in 1972, looking at the buildings, asking the question, does this building still look like it did in 1925? I found 55 sites and took 93 pictures. For a beginning corner, I used Pleasant View Road and the Levering Cross Village Road corners, as Bliss Township is to the north and mostly west of this corner. The east line is 1 mile to the east. Picture number 1. 1/4 mile to the west is where the Old Cross Village Sheboygan Trail entered the township. So this is my first snap. It was also used as a logging road. My dad owned this 80 wood acres, and we used this old road when getting our firewood. Jackson and Tyndall lumbered this 80 before my time. It was interesting to learn that 3 of this section's homesteaders built their log cabins near this trail. In fact, for this southeast quarter section, the frame upright part of the house was also built here. Then moved to the Pleasant View Road. It will be the first picture of the second set of pictures. Number 2. This is the Andrew Orr farm home. They were our close friends. They had the dealership for the International Farm Implement Company. They also had a gasoline pump where the white spot is near the barn. They always had a good garden west of the barn. Mrs. Orr was organist for the Canby Sunday School and social events and for the Canby Quartet. Both of the Orr parents came with their families at an early age to Cross Village and then to our area. Orrs had 2 daughters, Sarah, her grandson Brian Staley now owns the place, and Ruby, Mrs. Mervyn Small Street, lives on the Small Street Road. Picture number 3. This is the Jake Goebel farm. These buildings have changed since 1972. Goebel was an early homesteader when the roads were laid out. He moved buying this location. The nearby corner became known as Goebel's Corners. From 1917 on, Leo Searles and his family lived here. Next picture. We travel 1/2 mile west through a swamp to a hilltop where we can see Lake Michigan over the lower elevation. At the next corner is the Canby Schoolhouse. This building was standardized in the 1920s. by adding the east windows to the west side, causing daylight to come to the pupils' left side. An addition, where the short windows are, was built across the front of the building with a hallway in the center, and on each side was a cloakroom for wraps and dinner pails and a restroom. The boys' side is the corner that you see. The small, low building covers the pump motor. In my day, it was a hand pump that needed no protection. From an early day, this building was used for Sunday school and was the neighborhood meeting hall. Next picture. 1972, it still had its bell and belfry. It was the last school in the township to consolidate with Pellston. Bottled gas has become the fuel for heat. Next picture. But the good old woodshed and chimney still remain. The large floor furnace sat in this northwest corner of the schoolhouse. It burned wood and coal. The long stovepipe going to the chimney helped with the heating. Many fond memories are associated with this building, as it was our group's social center. Next picture. Looking west from this school corner of Canby and Levering Roads is the Clark-Dixon farm home. They were of our inner circle of society. She was the soprano of the Canby Quartet of the 1920s. With their two sons, Gene and Bill, they had a large herd of cattle. A visit with them by former residents made the trip to the area really like going back home. Next. This is a view from Levering Cross Village Road and a bit west of Canby Road, looking north into Bliss Township. This is the Matthew house. The bank barn had been torn down by then. Edwin D. Matthew homesteaded this quarter section in 1875. This corner portion was kept in the family. Grandma Matthew lived to be an old lady of 95 years. It was she who named the community Canby, after a state representative, Israel Canby. He is buried in the GAR part of Harbor Springs Cemetery. Next. This shows the other side of the house, which used to contain many precious items. In the 1940s and early 50s, this lawn held the annual Canby reunion. Picture number 7. A mile north from the Canby School is the Byhaw Road. The George Byhaw Farm buildings were 1/2 mile west on the right. Across the road was the homestead of the senior Byhaw. His older son, Frank's farm, was on the Canby Road. Frank's buildings had been torn down by 1972. Kenneth Apatoski was his youngest child. The Byhaw Road does not go east of Canby Road because of what you will soon see. 8A. On the northwest corner of the Byhaw and Canby Roads was the Samuel Gill home. Their home was named the Maples. This picture was taken 1925 or before. He harnessed Red Creek by the use of a ram, so there was water at the buildings. Mrs. Angie Gill was a worker in the Sunday school. They had 2 daughters, Hazel and Auda. Auda's son, Gil Fuller, owns the farm. 8B. This is a recent view. You can see how the maple trees have grown in 50 years. Number 9. This is Red Creek, which starts in the swamp we passed on the Levering Road. It flows across sections 34, 27, and 28 into White Camp Lake. In my day, this was a narrow stream. It appears that something happened to make it almost a pond. We used to cross it on an old log bridge. Since the auto and wood cutting, the roadway has a second growth of trees. Near the east side of Red Creek is the foot of Jubb Hill. These next three pictures do not do justice to its length or steepness. Again, the trees have taken over. I remember it as an eroded and too steep for horses and wagon, not to mention autos. When I was small, Dad led our gentle driving horse hitched to a small buggy down it. Mother and I walked down. No one since Jubbs moved away have lived on this mile. It was not worth the expense to grade down the hill to make it passable. The roadway now has reverted back to the owners. A carpet of spring flowers in the old Overholt woods on the north side of the abandoned Cassidy Road and a bit east of Jubb Hill. We continue walking this abandoned road to Valley and Cassidy Corners. On the southwest is the site of the South Bliss old log schoolhouse from 1880 to 1900, when the frame schoolhouse was built. It stood about where the lady stands. Another shot of the same place. When the school was here, the land was all covered with trees and brush, according to a 1899 pupil, Fred Mallory. Kids played then in the woods. From this corner, we will look north. The valley is the north arm or side of Potato Soup Valley, which ends about a half a mile to the left. The buildings on the left side are the Overholt farm, whose spring flowers we just saw. Buildings on the right were the George Mallory's buildings. We will go up the hill and look back. This is the lovely Overholt buildings that Mr. Martin Overholt Sr. built. His great-grandson Leonard built a modern house to the right. This house was torn down soon after this picture. Leonard's grandfather, Oscar, lived here. He was Bliss Township supervisor and on the Emmett County Road Commission. This house is the improved home of George Mallory of early 1900 era. This large family moved from southern Michigan, driving through with teams and wagons. In the 1920s, they moved to Pellston to work in the lumber mill. The place was a rental until Oscar's son, Martin Overholt Jr., bought it. Former buildings for nearly a mile to the north have burned or changed until we come to the old Charles Athern place. The lines of the house are the same, though in the process of getting new siding. Charles and wife had 6 children. They also moved from Woodland, Michigan, in Berry County, in a covered wagon in 1899. 2 of his sons, Alvin and Orrin, had farms within a mile to the west of here. 15A. Alvin's farm was on the south side of the Garber Road. We see a bit of the bank barn here. Here is a closer view of the house. There is none of this large family left in the area. Present owners have a travel trailer near the house. Now we will go back to the Charles Athern place and proceed north. Looking back at the place from the north, The youngest child, Nora, and husband Harry Taylor, lived here caring for her parents and worked the farm. Going a bit farther north, we see the Franklin Kaiser 1875 homestead farm. Farm buildings like these were built about 1900. The first log cabin usually was built back in on the land, as there were no roads in the homestead era. Today you would see here a Centennial Farm marker in front of the house, as some descendant has always lived on this land. Mrs. Maud Bacon lives here now, in 1984. Her children will continue to own it. This family has always held township offices. Franklin donated land from his northeast corner for the United Brethren Church and for the district school house at East Bliss. 17A. We will now return to the Valley and Cassidy Road corner and go south 1/8 of a mile to Potato Soup Valley, which is horseshoe shaped. This is the south side of the shoe. This shows the location of the spring that gave the early landlookers of about 1876 the water to make potato soup for their lunch. This is taken from the grade road fill, looking mostly south. This is the same location in the wintertime. This camera scratched its film, so I parted with it. This view looks west to the open end of the Horseshoe Valley, which ends before reaching the top of Jubb Hill. 18A. Looking east from the fill, near the right X, the valley starts turning left or northward. The valley is behind the left X and then crosses Cassidy Road. 18B. The same view in summertime. The farther rim is near X. The inner rim is the foreground. It is a narrow valley. Its hills cover more land than the valley. It is our stone pile and Jersey cows you see in the picture. Our cattle in the valley just before it crosses Cassidy Road. It is the Elmer Kilpatrick buildings in the background. 30 years she wrote of local happenings under the heading of Potato Soup Valley for 3 different newspapers. She lived to be 95. Later the house burned. Overholtz bought the land and tore down the large bank barn. We will go back to Valley Road, go up the south rim, then 1/4 mile more, then turn and go 1/8 mile on private land, coming to Red Creek again, where it is angling across section 34. This is the spot where the Cross Village Sheboygan Trail crossed the creek. Early roads also crossed here. The early road to Canby turned about where the X is and went through the woods to the left. Remember, the creek has been flowing through the swamps on the left. The X marks the site of Homesteader's log cabin in the southwest quarter section. This was a lovely scene from my old home. A close view of the neglected creek. There was a log bridge here when I was a child. Many times I have crossed it when walking to Sunday school. Mr. William Farr, the owner of this land, used the bridge to get his farm machinery and loads of hay to and from the field that you see. 21A. The creek has just crossed the Charles carriage land on the west side of Valley Road. This is their house, taken from the south. Their barns and farm buildings were on the east side of the road. Charles and Sophie came to the area in an early day and had a large family. Descendants live in the township and county. We will go back north to Albert Fay's first farm, which is across Valley Road from Farr's. We passed it on the way to the creek. By 1972, our buildings were so changed that they did not rate for this tour. About 1926, local farmers started raising sweet clover for a hay crop. This crop was so heavy and tall, Dad had to hire a man to walk along behind the mower to clear the cutting bar. Number 22B. Fay's first farm had been so improved or modernized that even the cement well casing was removed from the top of the 185-foot well that Dad put down in 1908. This bit of history scratched inside of the casing I saw in 1972. This well was made July 1908. This 1925 picture shows the windmill frame, the granary, and a bit of the tool shed, and the big barn up the lane. The main barn was to the left, and the house to the right of this scene. This little girl wanted her doll's picture taken, and I think she was cuter than the woman of 1972 who took these pictures and who is explaining them now. This starts part 2 of the travelogue. Again, we will use card number 1, looking at the red numbers. At this point, we will have to go back to the point of beginning at the Pleasant View Levering Road corners. We will go north on Pleasant View Road. Number 24. On our left is the home of Jewel and Jenny Hartness from 1907 to 1920. They moved the upright part of the house that was built back in the woods on the Old Cross Village Sheboygan Trail to this location when the roads were laid out. They were good friends of ours. This mile is unusual. It is level. The next place was Gladys Churchill Larson's old home. The buildings burned. Modern ones are there now. So we'll go on to the Burton Patterson place. Bert built this house himself. As a young man, he was fireman on Clyce's Railroad. When big highway construction equipment came into being, he worked on the Emma County steam shovel for 19 years. His family lived here until Mrs. Patterson died in 1931. Number 26. 1 acre was taken out of the northeast corner of the Patterson farm for the South Bliss schoolhouse. This was my grade school. Martin Overholt Sr. of Valley Road built this in 1900. In the 1920s, the bell was in the belfry above the entrance. That tall cement object in front held the bell in the school's later years. The newer flagpole base is in line with the center window. The steps were wooden and came straight down. Above the left X stands the hand pump. This school was not standardized. You see the 3 north windows, also the cold air vent from the floor furnace that stood in the near corner. The woodshed that held wood and coal is at the back. Chemical toilets had the 2 east corners inside the woodshed. That part of a building peeking from the left is a kitchen built on when the Bliss Grange owned the building. Since then, two couples have owned it, but neither really lived here. Later, a religious group bought it and called it Bliss Chapel. 26A. They changed the name again. This is how it looks September 1984. Number 27. Bliss Township extends 1 mile east of Pleasant View Road, so we will turn east onto Cassidy Road, go 1/2 mile. On the north side of the road lays the old James Smith 80-acre farm. They had raised their family of 3 sons there by 1920. I don't know if they built the buildings or if an owner before them did. This is a typical style farm building of this area until one looks closely at the gable end. The camera from the road did not pick up the detail. 27A. With another film developed another place, here is the detail, even with a different color. See the ornamental gables with curved and diamond-shaped shingles. When the house was recited, they were wise enough to leave the design gable end. See the detail at the top of the window casings. Later I was told that there were other houses with decorated gable ends, but in the early 1900s the gable covering was changed. Samuel J. Orr homesteaded this southeast quarter section November 19, 1879. Some years later, his son Samuel and wife Lucy, whose maiden name was Crandall, owned the west 80 acres of that homestead and built these buildings with the design gable ends. Sam Jr. moved from the farm to Levering. By 1925, Nathan Kilpatrick owned the place and had a raspberry farm here. Here I earned money to buy my high school textbooks in the Depression era. Several people have lived here since. Now the great-great-granddaughter of pioneer William Mallory, Donna Harrington, owns it in 1984. Across the road, on the south side of the road, starts the homestead of Peter Kaiser, a brother of Franklin on Valley Road. He had the first frame house in the neighborhood. He set out a row of maple trees in front, so he has a living memorial. His son Fred took over this quarter section, and his sons have continued to own it. 28. We stand on the corner of the Cassidy and Kaiser Roads, looking northeast into Carp Lake Township, and see Tom's Cassidy house. It was because of him and his sons, who owned adjoining farms, that Cassidy Road was named. They are big cattle and potato farmers. We turn right onto the 1 mile Kaiser Road. Peter's oldest son, Clinton, owned 80 acres adjoining Peter's south side. He and family lived here all his life. Mr. and Mrs. John McLarty have owned it a number of years. It is now her summer home since she is a widow. Peter's other son, Alpheus, owned the south 80 acres, so the east half of Section 36 was owned by Kaisers. This is on the Levering Road. The present owner built a modern house to the right of this house and tore down this house soon after this picture was taken. A large herd of cattle used this large bank barn then and yet. Another 80 acres across the road goes with this farm. Number 38. We will go back now to South Bliss School and continue north 1/4 mile. Back in the 1920s, we could see from the schoolhouse old camp buildings here. During the 1900 era, Kleist ran his narrow gauge railroad from Sturgeon Bay through this section 25, about 1.5 miles east, then southeast into the next township. He followed the valleys and most level ground, running temporary spurs from it to areas where his men were cutting timber. Number 30, B. The railroad ran eastward about where this stone house is. Here was a substation with the wooden water tank tower for the engine. There must have been a small store, as old-timers called it, potato station. The nearby farmer sold their extra potatoes here to Kleist for his Sturgeon Bay boarding house. He hauled the potatoes on the railroad. This is looking back at the terrain. To the north, 3/4 of a mile, is the Garber Road. For you old-timers who knew Don Garber and his men's clothing store on Mitchell Street, Petoskey, Michigan, this was his father's homestead. 2 uncles lived to the west. This is also the site of Bliss Township's first school in 1877, looking southwest where the X is. It was abandoned 6 years later when the East Bliss schoolhouse was built. In the early day, there was much contention of where schools were to be built. Annual school meetings were hot times. On the east side of Pleasant View Road, just south of Garber Road, is the Church of God, the first church built in the township in 1900. The additions were made in 1947. The early members either died or moved away to the big cities. They struggled on as long as they could. The interior in the 1970s looked like the famous historical churches in the East. It could have been a tourist attraction, but the owners thought it was sacrilegious. Another view of the church, it has not been used since 1963. Insert map card number 2. Joining the church property on the north lays the Luther and Rhoda Bliss homestead of 1875. Tradition says that because they camped on the land late in the fall while they built their log cabin, the township was named to honor Rhoda Bliss. Women usually remained in Cross Village or with friends or neighbors while the man put up the cabin. I never heard of the cabin's location, but this hill is back of the frame buildings. There was a spring near the top. Orrin Merwins piped the water to the buildings. They were owners from 1892 to 1920s when Grant Kaiser bought it. The small street road splits this land. We will turn right onto it for 1/2 mile, then onto the short Cousins Road. Here is the Stephen Cousins homestead and his frame house as we view it while approaching. This is the front, but like so many, the descendants wanted modern style instead of repairing the old interior, so it was torn down. I preferred the old. We will go back to the Pleasant View Road and see, across from the Luther Bliss home, the homestead of Alonzo Larson. He later built these frame buildings. His wife taught the Garber School across the road to the south. Years later, after she died, he moved to Harbor Springs. Charles Fay owned it for a few years. It was here that my parents spent their first week in Bliss Township in 1903 while looking for Albert's future home. Later, Grant Kaiser owned it. Later owners let it go uncared for, so that by 1983, all of the buildings were gone. 36A. We travel on around the bend as high hills are on the section line. We see Bliss Village in the distance, but this picture is to record an old-fashioned corn crib, a building to dry and cure husk ears of corn. It is on the Jerome Kaiser homestead. This frame house looks about the same as I remember it. Likely there was a porch back of the auto. Dr. Lentini's parents bought it when coming to this area about 1920 and lived there until they died. As was often the case in the early day, the house is on one side of the road and the farm buildings are on the other. Looking back at it shows the hills. Perhaps there was a spring on the house side. I know that there was a pond south of the house, large enough to baptize people in. The Church of God held camp meetings in the grove south of there. On the barn side is the level farmland. We face north to see the Henry Leasing homestead. The hill back of the house stands by itself. Partway up was a spring. Its water was piped to the house. The place was later owned by son Irving, who is the parent of Petoskey Leasings. Irving retired to Florida, and the property became owned by newcomers. This is looking back at it from the cemetery. The township cemetery is out of this land. Number 38. From the top of the Leasing Hill that we just saw, one could catch this view of Bliss in 1963. At the left side is the cemetery, then the store. Across the road to the left is the school, then the church. Back to the right are houses. Some are gone now. The Bliss Hill starts to rise by the church. It is a long, steep hill on a needed roadway, so it had to be cut down and reworked many times, costing much money. This is the Bliss Cemetery, Memorial Day 1972, looking east. The original first acre is in the foreground. There have been 3 additions over the years. In 1980, it was 4.5 acres. The maple trees were set out in 1909. The vault behind the spruce trees was built about 1928. Number 40. To the west, across Pleasant View Road, on the northwest corner, is the Bliss Village store. This building was built by Gideon Knoll in 1902. There have been other stores in the township, but they burned or were torn down. This building has had several owners. It is a limited general store with gas pump in front. The owner lives on the 2nd floor. B. This view is from the other side. Different buildings and houses have stood to the west and to the north. Before autos, Bliss was a busy little village. 41. South of the store is the East Bliss Schoolhouse. It was built in 1883, and the pupils moved from the Garber School. This is the east side. It looks like the back end of the building was extended as the population increased. The bell was originally in a belfry. This is the west side. It was the first frame school built in the township, and it is the only school built in East Bliss, or District Number 2, as the Garber School was in District Number 1, or South Bliss. Mark Kilpatrick of Mason, Michigan owns it as his vacation home. He is a grandson of Mrs. Elmer Kilpatrick. Number 42. The east side of the United Brethren Church. All other pictures have been taken from the northwest corner, showing the door and the west side. This church was dedicated May 4th, 1903. Besides for church services, it was where most funerals were held, also the Memorial Day observation, and Sunday school conventions. In 1965, the Methodist Church merged with the United Brethren Churches, so this slightly used building was for sale. The local committee headed by a few loyal women bought it, renamed it Bliss Memorial Church. It is still used for local funerals, Memorial Day, and homecoming in October. More of its history is in the book called A Century of Bliss. Here are several inside views. This shows the entrance and doorways. Above the square entrance rises the bell tower. The flag contains a star for each Bliss boy in World War I. There is one gold star for he who died. Their names are framed in the picture below it. To the right is the platform. On it is the pulpit, a square table, some straight chairs, the singer's pew seat, and the piano. The windows are made of stained and frosted glass. They are lovely, interesting in their history. They and the lovely railing will appear later. 42C. This is the east inside of the church, showing the wainscoting, the piano, and a picture of the church with a large gathering of an early day, and two of the windows. The bottom of all windows are red stained glass, with the donor's name in white letters. The farther one is Mr. and Mrs. Wilson Mann. The next one is Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Cousin. The one to the south has no name, but was paid for by William Kilpatrick. This is a closer view of the piano, window, and railing. Isn't it lovely? This is of the Cousin's window. This is the west windows with no flash attachment on this camera, but it shows the initials, which means James F. Jocelyn and Charles L. Kaiser. The other one was paid by Franklin Kaiser and unnamed. A clearer view of the church front. A bit of the lower windows show, which say UB Church on the left window, and Reverend E. McFarland on the right window. He was a pastor at the time the church was built. Also the pulpit, the choir pew, railing, and the oil lamps. This church has never been wired. These ladies in the picture put on a historical skit for the Bliss homecoming in 1976. Number 43. This is the beech grove behind the church. The trees are larger now than when long tables with benches accommodated all-day Sunday school conventions and other meetings. Evening meetings were limited, as farmers had chores to do. One lone plank survives to show the table's location. There was not much underbrush there in the 1940s. 44. At the foot of Bliss Hill, on the north side of Sturgeon Bay Trail, is a former home, store, and post office. Mr. Jocelyn built it in the late 1800s. They moved to Levering about 1905. Gideon Knoll lived there many years and had the post office. His daughter and family, Lawrence Overholtz, lived there some years. An early sawmill used to be to the northwest of the house. We climb the Bliss Hill and go a little ways farther to see this view of 1923. On the left are two old buildings from Clyce Lumber Camp. Across the road is the John Brock Farm. They came to Bliss about 1903. Sam Gill, as road overseer, with local men working out their road tax, are grading and improving the road near these buildings. This picture and a few others does not meet requirements for this travelogue, but it has too much history not to use. We go up to the horizon and get a wonderful surprise. We can see way out on Lake Michigan with a wide view. Here we will use map card number 3. 46. At the north end of Cambry Road is this United Missionary Church. It is the former Mennonite Brethren in Christ Church, built in 1902. It is the same denomination, but Conference changed its name in 1947. The Sunday school rooms were built on in 1970 across the back end with the entrance doors. The front entrance became pulpit platform. The pews were reversed to face what was the entrance. This is a thriving church and Sunday school of the area. We look down the road west and see the Dow Mallory farm home. It was owned by his father, William Mallory, who also came from Berry County 1899, driving through by teams and wagons. Dow had a big family. Most of them lived in the township. This family were and are workers in the local government and in the Sunday school and church. Out of his land came space for the township hall right next to his orchard. This is the hall's west side. Mallory's buildings are in the background. Now the township library is set up in the hall and open certain days of the week. It is a branch out of Mackinac City's public library. When I was a girl, each school district had a public library, but now there are no local schools as they are consolidated with the Pellston schools. Number 49. The adjoining house to the west is the 1905 Harry and Blanche Marshall place. They were prosperous farmers and were well liked. There were 3 daughters and 2 sons. Son Theodore lives there now on the farm. The barn burned in 1968. Number 50. At the next corner of Sturgeon Bay and West Bliss Roads is the West Bliss Schoolhouse. Here was this district's first school building, just a shack, used only for a few months. Next At the same site was a hand-hewed log building. That was replaced in 1895 with this frame building. This building, like Canby, was standardized. See, all the windows are on one side. The covered well pit with motored pump for running water and the electrical wires. Here, like South Bliss, is the recessed entrance. It does not look like they had to add on for the restrooms. This school was built large enough to care for the pupils of Clay's employees at Sturgeon Bay. A gas furnace has replaced the old wood and coal furnace. We will go north 1/4 mile from the school. On the west side of West Bliss Road was the Glenn Farrell farm home. He came to the township in the early 1900s. They had 2 sons, and Emma Farrell Reinbold. She was the Emmett County Home Demonstration Agent from 1944 to 1967. Another half mile takes us to the Clark Marshall homestead. His name is often found in Bliss history. His son Earl became the next owner of this land and was important in the township. 2 other sons lived on nearby farms. Earl's son Frank now owns it. It should be marked as a centennial farm. We will go back to the schoolhouse and travel west on Sturgeon Bay Trail until we come to Lake Michigan. Here was Clay's Sturgeon Bay mill town from 1890s to 1913. It was the largest town in the township, with a store, a post office, many houses, the mill, and all the buildings connected with such an enterprise, and a boarding house. The narrow gauge railroad went out from here. There were faint marks yet in 1972 of its tracks running along the base of the sand hill beside the road. Huge docks were built that could hold enough lumber piles to load 3 ships. But they and all signs of the town are gone. Just these trees, where Sturgeon Bay Drive curves northward along the lake, remain. Here ends our travelogue. You can go south to Cross Village or go north to Mackinac. How you return is your choice. I thank you.